The countdown hits 0. 33 engines are supposed to roar to life at once. 29 do, 4 stay dark. And in that instant, the flight computer freezes the world's most powerful rocket right where it stands. No explosion, no fireball, just steam rolling across the pad, and a 400-foot vehicle that was built to fly refusing to move. That happened on Thursday, July 16th, 2026, at Starbase, Texas. It's the first full-stack ignition abort in the entire history of the Starship program. And as of today, 4 days later, the rocket still hasn't left the ground. This is the story of Starship, Flight 13, why it stopped, what SpaceX has done since, and why the real mystery isn't just when will it launch, it's what does this tell us about the machine humanity is betting the moon and Mars on? Every one of the 12 flights before this one taught SpaceX something: how the vehicle handles stage separation, how it survives re-entry heat, how close it can get to a controlled landing. Flight 13 was supposed to add the next chapter. Instead, it added a new kind of lesson, one about the very first moment of flight itself. Let's set the scene. Starbase itself is worth picturing for a second. It's not a historic government launch complex like Cape Canaveral. It's a purpose-built industrial site on the Texas Gulf Coast near Boca Chica Beach that SpaceX constructed from scratch specifically to build and fly Starship. Massive assembly buildings sit just a short distance from the launch pads, so a booster can go from factory floor to fueling in the same afternoon. That proximity is part of the design philosophy. Build fast, test fast, fix fast, and fly again. Flight 13 was never meant to be routine. It's only the second flight of Starship's newest configuration, called version 3, a heavily upgraded booster and ship that debuted back in May. Every piece of hardware on that pad was flying for the first time. And for the first time ever, Starship wasn't carrying practice weight. It was carrying a real payload. 20 next-generation Starlink satellites designed to deploy solar arrays, extend antennas, and try connecting to the existing network using laser links. 12 previous flights had carried simulators. This one was carrying an actual product. So when the countdown reached ignition and the engines didn't fully light, it wasn't a footnote. It was the vehicle's most important test yet, stopped, cold at the one moment where hesitation isn't an option. Here's what's confirmed. SpaceX spokesperson Dan Hute said live on the broadcast, "We did trigger a hold on the booster that aborted our liftoff as we were starting to light those Raptor engines." Minutes later, Elon Musk posted the cause directly on X. Some of the engines didn't start, triggering an automatic launch abort. Independent trackers watching the live telemetry, including NASAspaceflight.com and Spaceflight Now, reported that only 29 of the booster's 33 engines actually ignited. SpaceX hasn't officially published that exact number, but multiple outlets watching the same feed arrived at it independently, which makes it the most reliable figure we have. What happened next moved fast. Engineers began draining the rocket's propellant within minutes. The booster was rolled back to Starbase's assembly building for inspection, and within hours, Musk announced the fix. To be confident of a good flight, 2 Raptors will be removed and replaced. 2 engines out of 33. That's the reason sitting at the literal core of this rocket. The ring of engines that has to fire in perfect unison, or the whole vehicle stays grounded. Picture the scale of what almost happened and then didn't. A rocket taller than a 40-story building, fully fueled, 3 seconds from flight, with millions of viewers watching a live stream that had already built toward this exact moment for hours. And then, nothing. Nothing you could point a camera at and call dramatic in the traditional sense. Just hold a hiss of vented gas and a countdown clock that stopped meaning anything. Now, a quick but important distinction, because it matters for everything that follows. It's confirmed that engines failed to ignite. It's confirmed that 2 are being physically swapped. What's not yet confirmed is the deeper root cause, the exact reason those engines didn't fire. SpaceX tends to identify affected hardware quickly and only explain the underlying why much later, if ever. So treat any specific technical explanation you hear beyond ignition failure engine. Replacement as informed guessing, not established fact. There's also a strange twist of timing here. The original backup date for the next attempt was July the 20th, the same date Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and the same date, 7 years later, that Viking 1 touched down on Mars. Had Starship flown that day, it would have joined one of the most storied dates in spaceflight history. It didn't happen. Today is July the 20th, 2026, and Starship is still on the ground. SpaceX has now shifted its target to Thursday, July 23rd. A countdown rehearsal reportedly began at Starbase on July 19th, a sign the engine swap may already be done. Think about what that means in practical terms. SpaceX doesn't just fly Starship once a year and call it a program. The entire business model, Starlink expansion, NASA's lunar lander contract, eventually Mars, depends on flying this rocket often and flying it reliably. A scrub like this doesn't just cost a few days. It costs a launch window, a satellite deployment opportunity, and a small dent in the confidence of everyone watching whether this vehicle is ready to graduate from test program to workhorse. It also happened in full public view. Starship launches are live-streamed, narrated, and picked apart in real time by thousands of independent observers with their own cameras trained on the pad. There's no quiet failure in this program. Every scrub becomes a shared moment, replayed frame by frame within minutes. So here's where we're headed. To understand why 4 silent engines can ground the biggest rocket ever built, we need to understand the machine itself, and why this specific flight was carrying more weight than almost any Starship test before it. Starship isn't one rocket, it's 2, stacked together. The bottom half is super heavy, the booster, packed with 33 engines arranged in rings at its base. The top half is ship, the upper stage that's meant to eventually carry astronauts to the Moon and Mars. Stacked together, the whole vehicle stands roughly 400 feet tall. That's taller than the Saturn V that sent Apollo to the Moon. It's the largest rocket humanity has ever tried to fly. The engine at the center of this story is called Raptor, specifically Raptor 3, the newest version. It runs on a design called full flow staged combustion. In plain terms, it's the most efficient way anyone has figured out how to burn rocket fuel. Both propellants, methane and liquid oxygen, get turned into gas and driven through turbopumps before final combustion. That squeezes more performance out of every drop of fuel, but it also means each engine runs at extreme pressure, with almost no room for error in exactly how it ignites. Raptor itself has already been through several generations. The earliest versions that flew on Starship's first test flights were heavier, more complex, and harder to manufacture at scale. Raptor 3, the version flying on this booster, strips away much of that complexity. Fewer external plumbing lines, a simpler bolt-on design, and a lighter structure, all meant to make the engine both cheaper to build and easier to inspect between flights. It represents years of iteration specifically aimed at making an engine this powerful behave predictably again and again. That iteration matters here, because Raptor 3 is still a relatively young design in operational terms. It has flown far fewer times than something like Falcon 9's Merlin engine, which has accumulated hundreds of flights and an enormous amount of real-world data. Every new fuel. This is why the flight computer's decision on July 16th wasn't a malfunction. It was the system working exactly as designed. Starship's software constantly compares real engine performance against what's expected during ignition. If the numbers don't match, if several engines don't confirm ignition, the computer doesn't wait for a human. It shuts everything down in milliseconds before an unbalanced rocket can leave the pad. That's not really a failure story. It's a safety story hiding inside a disappointing headline. It's worth remembering that this kind of automated protection didn't always exist in spaceflight. Early rocket programs relied far more heavily on human judgment calls in the final seconds before launch, with far less real-time data to work from. Modern vehicles like Starship are built around the idea that the software itself should be the last line of defense, faster to react, and free of the instinct to hope a borderline reading will sort itself out once the engines are already lit. Compare this to Flight 12, the only other flight of this same V3 design back in May. It made it off the pad, but 2 of its objectives, relighting a Raptor engine in space and landing the booster in a controlled splashdown, weren't fully achieved. Flight 13 was built to pick up exactly where that flight left off, relight the engine, land the booster, and for the first time, deploy a real working payload. That context is what makes this abort more than a routine delay. This is only the second flight of this exact hardware. Both the booster and the ship were brand new, flying for the very first time, when the ignition anomaly occurred. An issue like this, on such early hardware, is exactly the kind of signal engineers watch closest, because it tells them whether the new design's fuel systems and ignition sequencing behave the way simulations predicted. There's a physical clue worth mentioning too. This booster shows visible external changes from earlier versions. Additional steel heat shield protection added near its top, specifically meant to survive the heat of a technique called hot staging. That's when the upper stage ignites its engines while still attached to the booster below it, essentially using the booster as a launch platform, mid-air. It's confirmed visible hardware. Proof SpaceX has kept iterating on booster survivability, even while preparing this exact flight. Now, a careful distinction again, because it's the last time we'll pause on it directly. It's fact that engines failed to start. It's theory, not confirmed by SpaceX or any regulator, that this points to a broader reliability issue with Raptor 3 at scale, rather than an isolated defect in 2 specific units. Both explanations are plausible. Neither is proven yet. What we can say, responsibly, SpaceX's fast physical response, Pulling the booster in for inspection, naming specific engines for replacement within hours, suggests a company that believes it has found the affected hardware, even if the deeper cause isn't public. It's worth stepping back for a moment on why ignition itself is historically one of the hardest parts of any rocket launch, not just Starships. Across the history of spaceflight, engine ignition sequences have always been treated as the most dangerous few seconds of any mission, more scrutinized in some ways than the flight itself. During the Space Shuttle program, ignition sequences were staggered and monitored so closely that computers could halt a launch in the last 1.5 seconds if a single reading looked wrong, and that happened more than once in that program's history. The Saturn V that carried Apollo astronauts used a staggered ignition sequence for exactly this reason. Lighting all 5 of its engines at once was considered too risky to attempt. Starship, by comparison, is trying to light 33 engines together, a scale of synchronized ignition no rocket in history has previously attempted at this size. That context doesn't excuse an anomaly, but it does explain why engineers view ignition phase issues differently than in-flight issues. Full problem caught before liftoff, however dramatic it looks on a live stream, is generally far easier to diagnose and fix than the same problem discovered 40 miles up. It also explains why an abort like this one, however tense to watch, is treated internally as useful information rather than pure setback. Every ignition sequence that gets analyzed, successful or not, adds to the dataset that makes the next one more predictable. It's also worth remembering what Starship actually is at this point in its life. It's no longer just an experimental test vehicle. NASA has selected a version of it as the human landing system for the Artemis program, the mission architecture meant to return astronauts to the lunar surface. Every ignition sequence, every scrub, every engine swap at Starbase is now being read as a data point on one bigger question. How close is this rocket to being trusted with a crew? That's the real weight sitting underneath 4 dark engines on an otherwise ordinary Thursday evening. So where does that leave things today? 2 engines removed, 2 replaced, a new target of July 23rd, a rehearsal reportedly already underway. The next part of this story is about what a fix actually looks like in practice, and just how much is riding on it working. Here's what happens after a rocket this size comes within seconds of flight and then has to stand down. First, the propellant has to come off. Super chilled methane and liquid oxygen don't sit safely in a rocket. Indefinitely once a launch attempt is scrubbed this late. Draining both stages safely is itself a careful technical operation, not a simple shutoff. Second, the booster has to come home. It was rolled back from the pad to Starbase's assembly hangar so engineers could physically reach the base and inspect the engines involved. Moving hardware this size on and off the launch mount takes the same precision as stacking it in the first place. Third, and most specific, 2 Raptor 3 engines are being removed and replaced. Musk's own words, "To be confident of a good flight, 2 Raptors will be removed and replaced." Notice that gap. Several engines failed to register ignition on the pad. Only 2 are confirmed as being physically swapped. That gap is worth sitting with because it's one of the more telling details in this whole story. It suggests SpaceX's diagnostics pointed to 2 specific engines as the actual source of the problem, while the others may have failed to register ignition as a downstream effect like a pressure drop or a sequencing hiccup rather than a fault of their own. That's a reasonable technical read. It isn't something SpaceX has explicitly confirmed, so hold it as informed inference, not fact. While that hardware work moves forward, it's worth remembering exactly what's riding on the other side of a clean ignition, because this payload is unlike anything Starship has carried before. 20 next-generation Starlink satellites are packed inside the ship's payload bay. These aren't test weights. They're functioning satellites, part of SpaceX's plan to dramatically expand the internet. Constellation that's already one of the largest in orbit. Standard rockets aren't large enough to carry this new satellite design. Only Starship can. If the flight succeeds, the plan is for the satellites to extend their solar arrays and antennas mid-flight and attempt to connect with the existing network using laser links, all while riding along on Starship's own trajectory. Because this is a suborbital test, the satellites are expected to burn up on re-entry. Afterward, this flight is a proof of concept for the deployment system, not the start of the new satellites going live for customers. The laser link system on these satellites deserves a moment of its own, because it's one of the quieter technological leaps hiding inside this mission. Instead of relying only on radio signals to talk to ground stations, these satellites are designed to pass data to each other directly through space using lasers, forming a mesh. Mechanism works before trusting it, with satellites meant to operate for years. Beyond the payload, 2 more objectives carry over from the previous flight: relighting an engine on the ship during coast phase in space, and a controlled splashdown of the booster in the ocean, instead of the harder landing outcomes seen before. Both are meaningful steps toward full reusability. The entire economic case for Starship depends on relighting engines reliably in space and bringing boosters home in a repeatable way, rather than treating every flight as disposable. Stack it together, brand new hardware, the vehicle's first real payload, an inherited engine relight goal, and a splashdown attempt. Flight 13 was arguably the most objective-dense flight in the program's history, and it stopped at ignition. That's the real tension right now, not whether Starship flies again. It almost certainly will soon. The question is whether swapping two engines actually solves whatever caused the broader ignition anomaly, or whether it's a targeted patch to a problem that hasn't fully shown itself yet. It helps to remember what engineering caution actually looks like from the inside of a program like this. Every scrub means idle ground crews, a paused satellite deployment schedule, and a rocket sitting on a pad instead of proving itself in flight. None of that is free in time or in effort. Choosing to stand down anyway, rather than attempt a launch with unresolved questions about engine performance, is itself a signal about how the program is being run. Worth noting, the previous flight had its own engine-related hiccup during ascent. This flight couldn't get every booster engine lit at 0. 2 flights in a row on brand new hardware with engine issues is the kind of pattern engineers take seriously rather than write off as coincidence. That's an outside observation from analysts tracking the program, not something SpaceX itself has stated. SpaceX's public position remains that the 2-engine swap should resolve things for the next attempt. There's also a regulatory layer sitting quietly underneath all of this. Every Starship flight requires an active launch license from the Federal Aviation Administration, which reviews safety systems, flight termination procedures, and the vehicle's readiness before clearing it to fly. That process runs in parallel with SpaceX's own internal checks, and it's part of why launch dates for a program like this are always described as targets rather than guarantees. As of today, July 20th, the rocket is still on the ground. The next target, Thursday, July 23rd. With a 90-minute window opening in the evening, a rehearsal was reportedly underway 2 days ago, suggesting the engine work is finished and the vehicle is being prepped to return to the pad. SpaceX has been clear that even this date could shift depending on final inspections and weather. There's also a broader industry backdrop worth understanding here. SpaceX didn't invent reusable rockets from nothing. The company built its reputation on Falcon 9, which has landed and reflown its first stage boosters hundreds of times, turning what was once considered impossible into a routine Tuesday. That track record is exactly why so many people expect Starship to eventually reach the same level of reliability. But Starship is a different animal entirely. Falcon 9's first stage uses 9 engines. Super Heavy uses 33. Falcon 9 is expendable on its upper stage. Starship is designed to bring back both stages, every time. Every additional engine, every added reusability requirement, multiplies the number of things that have to go right simultaneously. That's not a criticism of the design. It's the entire reason Starship is considered such a leap forward if it works. A rocket this size, fully reusable, could eventually make launching a Starlink satellite, a cargo shipment, or eventually people to the moon closer in cost and complexity to running a large cargo plane than to today's expendable rockets. That's the prize sitting on the other side of a clean, successful ignition sequence. Which brings us to the deeper question this abortus really raises, not about one evening, but about where Starship is headed next. Starship is one of the boldest engineering bets in the history of spaceflight. A fully reusable rocket, both stages landing back to fly again, potentially within hours. Nothing built at this scale has ever achieved that. That's why an ignition abort, even one that ends quietly, carries real weight. It's not about one bad evening. It's about whether synchronizing 33 of the most advanced engines ever built, every single time, on demand, is a solved problem, or one still being solved in real time, flight by flight. Here's what we know for certain. 33 engines needed to fire together on July 16th. Several didn't. The flight computer caught it and safely halted the launch before the vehicle left the ground. Must confirm the cause within minutes and the fix within hours. Here's what we don't know and shouldn't pretend to. The precise engineering reason those engines failed. Whether it's an isolated fault in 2 units or a broader ignition issue tied to this new design, that detail hasn't been made public. Anyone claiming total certainty on the mechanism is going further than the record supports right now. And that's exactly why this deserves attention instead of a shrug. Starship has scrubbed before for weather for routine checks. Those are normal. An ignition abort at 0 on brand new hardware carrying the program's first real payload is not. It's the kind of event that becomes a case study, both for SpaceX's own engineers and for NASA officials evaluating this rocket's path toward carrying a crew. Look further down the road, and the pressure on Flight 13 makes even more sense. SpaceX has already said that catching the booster back at the launch tower, the dramatic maneuver where the tower's arms physically grab the returning rocket in midair, is planned for the flight after this one, not this one. That means Flight 13's splashdown attempt in the ocean is effectively the last rehearsal before SpaceX tries the far harder, far more visible catch on the very next mission. Every piece of data from this flight's landing burn feeds directly into whether that next attempt is safe to try. There's a quieter story here, too, easy to miss underneath the disappointment. The system worked, nothing exploded, nobody was hurt. The vehicle came back largely intact instead of in pieces. In an industry where the alternative to a clean abort can be catastrophic, that's its own kind of success. Proof that after more than a dozen flights, the safety systems protecting this rocket are doing exactly the job they were built to do. So here we are, on the same date Apollo 11 once landed on the moon, and Viking 1 once landed on Mars. Starship didn't add its name to that page this year. Instead, it's sitting at Starbase, engine work, reportedly finished, aiming now for July 23rd. Whether that date holds depends on the same unglamorous work that's defined this entire chapter. Inspections, checkouts, weather, and a flight computer about to watch 33 engines try to light in unison again. That discipline is exactly what separates programs that eventually succeed at reusable high-cadence spaceflight from those that don't. Every scrub is a choice to trust the process over the pressure of a countdown clock, a live stream audience, or a launch schedule. It's a slower kind of story than most people expect from a rocket company. There's no single dramatic villain here, no cover-up, no wasted flight. Just a machine that told the truth about itself at the one moment it mattered most, and a team choosing to listen to it. Somewhere at Starbase right now, that next attempt is being prepared. Quietly, methodically, far from any camera. A booster in a hangar. A checklist being worked through line by line. A team deciding, again, whether every box has really been checked before they let 33 engines try to speak in unison one more time. That's the part of this story that rarely makes the highlight reel, but it's the part that actually decides whether humanity gets back to the moon and eventually to Mars, on schedule or years behind it. The core held the answer this time. The next attempt will tell us if it was enough.